Okay, well, I'm sure there'll still be a few more people joining us, but I want to go ahead and get started. My name is Rebecca Craver. I am the Director of Congregational Development for the Moravian Church in the Southern Province. And along with the Board of Cooperative Ministries, we're glad to present this lecture from Reverend Dr. Heather Vacek about Protestant responses to mental illness. So I hope that you're excited like I am to hear what she has to say. And I'm also excited for the opportunity for us to have some interaction with one another as we gather in small groups. As I mentioned before, if you would like to, or if you would be willing to be a scribe in one of the small groups, I'd really appreciate your help. If you can let me know in the chat box that you'd be willing to do that, I will get your names selected for the different breakout rooms so that every breakout room has someone that can do that job. But without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker for you. Reverend Dr. Heather Hartung Vacek is the Vice President and Dean and Associate Professor of Church History at Moravian Theological Seminary and Lancaster Theological Seminary. She previously served as Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean of Faculty at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, as a trustee of Moravian Theological Seminary. Her book, Madness, American Protestant Responses to Mental Illness, explores Protestant reactions to mental illnesses from the colonial era through the 21st century. Vacek's research focuses on the historical relationship between Christian belief and practice in the American context, particularly around issues of suffering. In addition to her theological training at Duke Divinity School, Dr. Vacek holds engineering and business degrees from Northwestern University. So we're really glad to have you with us, Heather, and we're glad to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks to each of you for being here. One of the delights of doing this by Zoom is knowing that you all are joining from so many different cities and states. And so I'm glad to be gathered with you, even if we're not gathered in person. For the next 30 minutes or so, I'll offer an overview about how American Christians from both the distant and the more recent past have responded to mental illness. We'll then spend a little bit of time in small groups for a short period to have some conversation, and then come back together to ask questions, share insight from the conversations that you have. We'll take about 5 minutes after that to stretch, refill coffee perhaps, and then we'll come back together and I'll offer some reflections rooted in 2 scripture passages about how we might respond to the suffering that is so often associated with mental illness. We'll then repeat that time in small groups and come back together for some final questions and reflections. As Rebecca said, I am a historian, a theologian, and I have both theological and practical questions. And so I offer all of these reflections this morning to prompt conversation among us as people of faith and others about our current contexts. I assume that among us, there are a range of experiences with mental illness, direct and indirect, in those we love and in ourselves. And in the examples that I highlight this morning, I invite you to listen for what sounds familiar and what might sound new or novel. Hardships connected to the COVID-19 pandemic seem to have renewed some public interest in mental health and illness. Only time will tell the long-term consequences of this prolonged crisis on both individual and collective well-being, but recent research appears to support connections between the pandemic and heightened mental distress. This isn't surprising, given that COVID has prompted fear and suffering and grief and isolation. In the first months of the pandemic, more than 1 in 4 adults fit the criteria for serious mental distress. That was 8 times as many as had 2 years prior. At that same time, 3 times as many adults reported experiencing moderate to severe mental distress compared to the spring of 2018. More recent research shows that this increased incidence of distress has persisted. Suffering, though, hasn't fallen evenly among Americans, and recent studies indicate that COVID, along with structural racism and systemic poverty, has had an impact that has been adverse on mental health. Teenagers fared slightly better than adults as the pandemic began. Depression and loneliness were actually lower among teens in the spring of 2020 than in 2018. Their unhappiness and dissatisfaction with life rose higher during the pandemic, but only slightly. Polls conducted during the pandemic found that people with lower incomes are generally more likely to report major negative health impacts from worry or stress over the coronavirus. Adults and households with children have been more likely to report symptoms of anxiety or depressive disorder. Women were more likely to suffer than men. And the pandemic's mental health impact has been pronounced among the communities of color also experiencing disproportionately high rates of COVID-19 and deaths. Anecdotally, college counseling centers, including the one on the campus where I serve, are seeing an unprecedented demand for services. Surely people of faith can rely on the insight and witness of our tradition for guidance in responding to such suffering. American Protestants have always thought theologically and practically about mental illness. Over the centuries, understandings of mental illness have shifted and medical science has evolved. Suffering caused by mental illness persisted, however, and so regardless of their context, Christians attempted to respond faithfully, whether they were sufferers, family members, clergy, or caregiving professionals. In many ways, the categories of conversation in the last decade or so have matched the prior centuries. Amid suffering, Protestants have sought to make meaning, to find treatments, and to determine Christian responsibility. A quarter of a century ago, in 1996, an article in Christianity Today declared this: "Of all the forbidden subjects in the church, mental illness may be the surest conversation stopper, even though evidence suggests that it may be as pervasive in the church as it is in the broader society." When was the last time you read an announcement in the church bulletin that there will be a meeting of the support group for those who have experienced clinical depression? Or heard from the pulpit a prayer like, "Lord, help Brother Howard with his clinical depression"? Though that 1996 presumption about congregational life may remain true in many places, the frequency and volume of Protestant conversation about mental illness has since exploded, at least in popular print venues frequented by white believers. In recent years, authors wrote articles titled things like, "Is your church healthy for people with mental illness?" They addressed the truth about suicide and when your spouse is mentally ill. They noted, "Depression sufferers in your church wish you knew these 3 things." A fairly recent blog post included an interview with Kay Warren, who argued all church members can play a role in helping those with mental illness. Following their son Matthew's suicide, Kay and her husband, Pastor Rick Warren, have spoken frequently about the need for churches to respond more quickly and faithfully. These sorts of firsthand and direct secondhand accounts of illness emerged as a central genre of Protestant conversation about mental illness in the 21st century. Christians also thought together about mental illness in new venues. Believers gathered for conferences to address mental health, and new advocacy organizations emerged. The support groups named Missing in 1996 are now found at large and small congregations and well beyond church walls. But while much has changed, much remains the same. After a brief outline of the history of Protestant reactions in America before the 21st century, I'll share observations from the last decade or so. Here's a summary of that recent history. First, Protestants still suffered, and so, as I've already noted, they were more likely to talk about that suffering publicly and in detail. Second, they continued to try to find theological meaning amid distress. Third, they sought a variety of secular and spiritual cures. And finally, Protestants worked to discern faithful responses and did so aware that mental illness remained stigmatized. More recent developments sit atop hundreds of years of earlier history. In each period, many things combined to shape responses, including definitions of illness, medical treatments, the authority of clergy, personal experience, societal tensions, and the place of the church in national life. Human suffering has always concerned American Christians, but not all distress has earned the same response. In each period from the colonial era on, Protestants professed to care for the well-being of bodies, minds, souls, but those living with mental illnesses often received minimal attention. Good care was largely the exception rather than the rule. In the face of mental illness over 3 centuries, 2 forces combined to inhibit Protestants' ability to fulfill their stated mission of caring for the whole person. Most significantly, shifting professionalization, isolated clerical authority, and lay Christian authority in the private spiritual sphere, eventually leaving physical and mental healing as the responsibility of primarily secular medical professionals. In addition, the social stigma surrounding mental illness deepened, often making Protestants reluctant to engage sufferers in case they somehow be tainted by association. Adding to that stigma for many Christians was fear that mental illness might somehow signal trouble with one's soul, a vantage point that kept many from admitting suffering and seeking care. Though Christian inattention to mental illness formed the general pattern over the centuries, exceptions to that rule of benign neglect appeared. In the colonial era, illness was an expected part of life, and families and communities provided treatment and care. Church leaders like the Puritan clergyman Cotton Mather understood sin, whether personal or original, as the root of illness, but no more so for mental than physical ailments. All sickness, Mather argued, should simply prompt the believer to search their soul and turn to God for healing. Mather assumed that attending to one's own health and the welfare of others comprised part of the Christian life. Rather than a stigmatized ailment, madness, as he would have called it, was simply part of the reality of creation, and a reality that necessitated responses from those nearby. With the emergence of formalized medicine and Enlightenment rationality in the Revolutionary era, sickness became a problem to be solved rather than just a reality prompting spiritual reflection. Many Christians shared the scientific assessment of disease and looked to medical advances to bring relief. Some, like the Presbyterian clergy physician Benjamin Rush, pursued medical careers as part of a Christian duty to attend to suffering. Medical diagnoses eased the sense that sin caused disease, and mental distress remained just one form of illness worth remedying, albeit a particularly tough one. In the 19th century, general hospitals and institutions for the insane sprang up around the country and prompted a period of great hopefulness about treatment and cure for all disease. Protestants like the social crusader Dorothea Dix advocated on behalf of the afflicted to ensure the public provision of care for mental illness in new and existing facilities around the country. Dix was born into a Methodist family and later worshiped in the Congregational tradition, and those connections formed her sense of call. If you live somewhere within a 2-day drive of Boston, Massachusetts, there is likely a hospital or 2 or more that Dix helped either fund or launch. Despite widespread advocacy from those like Dix and the founding of many new hospitals, cures for physical ailments appeared more readily than remedies for mental maladies. By the late 19th century, squalid, crowded institutions and a growing number of chronic patients fueled public perceptions and suspicions that those who suffered with mental illness might bear responsibility for their own distress. It was during that period, a time marked by rapid industrialization and economic growth, that stigma firmly affixed to the nation's mentally ill. Those confined to asylums were deemed detached from dreams of American progress and prosperity. During the nation's progression from a colonial outpost to an emerging world power in the early 20th century, a period marked by tremendous church growth and institution building, the church, and particularly clergy, the church's representatives in the public sphere, found themselves struggling to compete with outside authorities in the provision of care for emotional illness. With mental distress by that time defined as primarily a medical concern, the advice of physicians was often trusted over the counsel of clergy. And many ministers sought training and worked to incorporate psychological insight into their caregiving. From the 1960s through the 1980s, Protestants looked inward to make meaning amidst illness. Writers in the Christian Century, a publication geared largely to white mainline clergy and other believers, sought to normalize mental illness, and did so at times by identifying famous American sufferers, including heiress Patty Hearst and the daughter of 1964 presidential candidate Barry Goldwater. The competing publication, Christianity Today, took a slightly different tact during that period and acclaimed suffering Christians, such as Charles Spurgeon, as saints whose illnesses benefited the church. In the mid-20th century, Protestants also assessed the validity of secular resources for healing, while the more progressive Christian Century deepened its affirmations of cooperation with such resources. Voices in the more evangelical Christianity Today fretted that such engagement might not be the most faithful Christian response to the emergence of psychology and psychiatry. Turning now to the most recent decade or so, insight from a handful of believers characterizes how these responses both persisted and shifted. In the 20th century, writers in the publications I've explored rarely described intricacies of mental illness or portrayed the daily difficulties of those who suffered. In the last decade, though, diagnoses were named with specificity and suffering talked about in great detail. Believers experienced suicidal thoughts, hallucinations, fear, and deep darkness. Family members voiced pain following the suicides of loved ones. Testimonies about illness made clear that mental illness was understood as a medical condition, at least in part. Writers readily named experience with anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and suicide. The shift in the directness with which maladies were described may be the result of greater public awareness of mental illness and some subsiding stigma. Over the last decade or so, publications profiled sufferers as men, women, children, professors, artists, writers, and those unemployed. A notable change in more recent coverage was the appearance of clergy as those afflicted, and even those who took their own lives. Those testimonies by pastors are a far cry from a 1956 article that asserted that clergy, at least well-behaved ministers, lived beyond the grasp of mental illness. That earlier article, titled "Are Ministers Cracking Up?", found it acceptable for some to suffer mental anguish, but not clergy. The author, Presbyterian minister and church leader William Hudnut, argued that the few clergy who did crack up did so because they lacked the discipline to crack down on themselves, implying that clergy should be more skilled at controlling their mental health than laity. In the past 10 years, a wide range of clergy weighed in about their own illness. The Episcopal priest Catherine Green McCrate contributed articles to both the Christian Century and Christianity Today, some based on her 2006 book, Darkness is My Only Companion. Theologian and African Methodist Episcopal minister Monica Coleman's book, Bipolar Faith, A Black woman's journey with faith and depression profiled decades of struggle with illness and her theological wrestling in response. Evangelical pastors Perry Noble and John Mark Comer each wrote candidly about their experiences with depression. As it had in the past, skepticism continued to appear about whether biological or spiritual factors caused mental illness. In 1957, an author argued some Christians may have come to such a state as to be genuinely psychotic and in need of psychiatric care, but no properly instructed Christian in a condition of full surrender to his Lord's need will be a victim of emotions. Emotional diseases might be real, he argued, but they could be prevented or remedied through right relationship with God. In more recent accounts, that sort of skepticism about purely biological origins was named not by those who suffered, but by their fellow congregants. The questions church members posed to longtime sufferer David Weiss pointed toward personal culpability. He was asked, "Are you secretly gay? Do you have some unconfessed sin? Are you possessed by a demon?" And told, "How dare you question God?" Weiss reported that he found the range of suspicions of his complicity in his own illness staggering. Regardless of its cause, in the 20th century and beyond, believers offered reasons that mental suffering might be advantageous for Christians. In 1976, a professor of philosophy of religion argued that mental illness could benefit the sufferer. He linked the heightened self-awareness brought about by mental illness and lacking, he said, in many healthy individuals who trudge through life's routines, to greater sensitivity to the self and thus greater possibilities for high spiritual accomplishments. In 1986, philosopher C. Stephen Evans treated those themes in greater detail. In an article titled "The Blessings of Mental Anguish," Evans reminded readers, God sometimes works through our human weakness rather than eliminating it, giving the clear sense that a persistent illness might in fact be part of God's providential ordering of our lives. And he noted that mental illness can be the occasion for spiritual growth. Evans, however, followed that line of thought further. He claimed learning how to live with a problem can make an individual better suited to accomplish significant tasks for the kingdom of God. Evans pointed to a number of odd Christian saints to prove his point that illness might be part of God's ordering of the world. He extolled 19th century philosopher and theologian Soren Kierkegaard as an example of a man whose psychological problems provided a rich harvest for the kingdom of God, and claimed that his psychological peculiarities were the means God had employed to call him to a special mission. A similar sense that God and humans can bring good out of suffering and that suffering is soul-making continued in the most recent reflections. Theologian Frederick Niedner observed that those who suffered offered insight to others. Typically, he said, those who help the rest of us make sense of our lives have themselves journeyed in the abyss. Sharing her experiences following the suicide of her son, Mother Christine Scheller shared, "I trust that for me, the crucible will forge a better person and lead to peace." David Weiss, who I mentioned a few moments ago, found comfort in God's presence. Though my illness persists, he reflected, I have finally met the God I had heard about but never truly experienced, a God who heals, a God who loves, a God I cannot logically explain to my psychiatrist, a God who manifests his genius by salvaging good from the evil in our lives, a God who calls himself Emmanuel, God with us. Weiss expressed relief that schizophrenia strained but did not snap his Christian beliefs. Recent Protestants professed the reality of mental illness and, as believers had for centuries, tried to understand their distress through the eyes of faith. Christians also sought relief from suffering. Pharmaceuticals played a large role in the treatment of mental illness during the 20th century, but were rarely discussed in popular publications. In contrast, the use of drugs to treat mental illnesses was frequently named and appeared largely unquestioned in more recent accounts. Thank God for pharmaceuticals, proclaimed clergyman Matt Gaventa in response to his father's clinical depression. Layperson David Weiss shared his use of medication and electroconvulsive therapy. In addition, congregants likely sensed little concern from clergy about seeking relief via psychiatric medication. Of the 1,000 Protestant pastors who responded to a 2014 survey, more than 85% believe that medication should be used, either in moderation or any time it could ease symptoms. At times, though, qualifications or reservations appeared. Anglican priest and theologian Joel Scandrette readily named his use of antidepressants combined with counseling, he said, but also noted the limit of drugs, especially as they might mute emotions that are essential components of spiritual maturity. Psychology professor Mark McKim understood medication as only one tool in treating depression. He warned that seeing depression just through a medical model fails to capture the complexity of a problem that is also related to past trauma, current social support, recent losses, guilt and shame, and spiritual concerns. Beyond medication, believers found relief and comfort in religious practice. Following his daughter's suicide, former Southern Baptist Convention President Frank Page urged sufferers and survivors to turn to passages of comfort in the Psalms. Author Amy Simpson described a spiritual experience that brought palpable assurance of God's presence amid the impact of her mother's illness. Evangelical personality Joni Eareckson Tada testified that prayers lifted her husband's depression. Counseling remained part of the mix of treatments and cures. Christian scholars debated the right approach to Christian counseling and the relationship between counseling and psychology, but such wrangling proved missing from the pages of popular print by laity and clergy. None of the dozens of articles over the past decade or so by sufferers, their families, or clergy explored or questioned proper counseling approaches. And a Lifeway survey of clergy indicated a vast majority of those respondents, more than 75%, were in favor of therapy. A later survey made no mention of different approaches to psychological therapy, as it reported that only 2% of pastors, family members, and sufferers advocated a faith-only response to mental illness. This marked a dramatic change from the prior century, when debate about psychology and psychiatry filled the pages of Protestant periodicals. Independent of preferred treatment methods, nearly every article about mental illness over the past 15 years weighed in with a plea for Christians to do something. Churchgoers were called to educate themselves, to offer support, and to turn to God for healing. Family members urged believers to learn about mental illness so that they weren't afraid to help. Amy Simpson, for example, whose award-winning book, Troubled Minds, profiled her experience as the daughter of a mentally ill mother, not only offered firsthand testimony in the pages of Christianity Today, she compiled a list of her top 5 books on mental illness. She hoped readers would better understand the problem, provide more effective care, think theologically, and find resources. Psychiatrist Matt Stanford urged some role for every congregation in addressing the issues of availability, affordability, and acceptability that often prevented sufferers from receiving care. Most frequently, writers called for accompaniment of those in distress. Sometimes that accompaniment took the form of encouragement to fellow sufferers. United Church of Christ pastor Norman Bendroth offered assurance that through God's grace, those who suffer can move past depression, even if its effects linger like the remnants of a sprained ankle. Suicide generated significant attention in the last decade or so, and many named a Christian responsibility not to abandon those who were suicidal or the families of those who took their own lives. If I am right, reflected the Reverend Green McCrate, and suicide does not destroy the soul of the Christian, then why would any church have difficulties burying those who died of suicide or comforting the families left behind? Most often, writers simply called on congregations not to ignore suffering. Pastor and current seminary president Craig Barnes named that even when fellow worshipers were not able to provide solutions to illness, they could remind sufferers and families that they remain claimed as beloved family members. Authors didn't expect accompaniment to be easy, but did name it as a central Christian responsibility. Psychiatry professor Dan Blazer called for Christian communities to accompany one another amid pain. Christians are called to walk with those who are weak, he said, and should welcome emotional pain that results from empathy and draws us alongside the afflicted. Blazer's article on depression ended with a sermonic appeal, offering thanks to God for Christ who makes all things new. Those who bear the marks of despair on their bodies need a community, he pled, that bears the world's only sure hope in its body. The church provides her depressed members with a plausible hope and a tangible reminder of the message they most need to hear. This sin-riddled reality does not have the last word. Christ, as embodied in his church, is the last word. Writers named the purpose of accompaniment as both the provision of comfort and the hope of turning believers toward God, the ultimate healer. In the earliest decades of the 21st century, stigma still played a role in perceptions of and responses to mental illness and kept Protestants from talking about their suffering and reaching out for care. Pastor Craig Barnes relayed his surprise in discovering that an active congregant who he'd known for 7 years had a son living with schizophrenia. Not until the crisis of the son's arrest after wielding a butcher knife in another church did his mother share his illness and name her own need for care. Stigma likely also kept clergy silent about their own distress. Matthew Stanford, the Baylor psychologist whose research explores Christianity and mental illness, named a double stigmatization of mental illness within the church that might be even more intense for clergy. You are committing career suicide, he said, if you have to seek treatment, particularly if you have to take time off. Author Amy Simpson's blog would not include posts titled 10 Ways Mental Illness is Stigmatized in Our Culture and 10 Ways Mental Illness is Stigmatized in the Church if she did not perceive stigma standing in the way of faithful Christian responses. Protestants might have talked about mental illness more freely in the 21st century, but they were not clear of the effects of stigma. In the early 20th century, diseases like polio and leprosy garnered attention in Protestant periodicals, but dropped from view nearly a century later, unless by way of a reflection on a gospel account of healing. American Christians no longer found themselves providing care or making meaning out of firsthand suffering from those ailments. It seems unlikely, however, that mental distress will disappear from Protestant experience anytime soon. And so clergy, theologians, biblical scholars, counselors, and other practitioners, along with everyday believers, should have plenty of work ahead as we experience help and observe the complex interactions between suffering, belief, practice, medicine, and social norms. We'll turn shortly to some time for conversation in smaller groups. If we were together, we could pretend this was around small round tables. And then we'll come back together as a group, and I welcome hearing your questions, your reactions, and your sense, or perhaps your experience of faithful responses. My hope is that by sharing what has gone well and what hasn't gone smoothly, we'll be able to forge a more faithful future and ease distress. In that light, I close this first section with a reflection from theologian Frederick Niedner. In the empty wilderness of someone else's darkness, we have no cures or magic. By grace, however, we may be like the manna on the desert floor. God makes of our simple, steady acts of accompaniment a measure of enough. Not much to look at, perhaps, and difficult to describe, but for today, enough. May it be so. Again, shortly, Rebecca will be splitting us up into small groups. She'll be with 4 to 6 folks. There will be a section of questions for you to answer in the chat. Use those as a guide. You don't have to answer every one of them. Take some notes, one of you, and we'll come back and put those in the chat box and continue conversation. Thank you, and see you soon back in the big group. Looks like folks are coming back in from small groups. Welcome back to the main group. For those of you who might have served as scribe in your small group, if you will cut and paste any summary reflections you have in the chat box, and that'll give the full group a chance to see some of the reflections. And then I would love to hear questions and observations, and Rebecca is going to help by monitoring the raised hands and any questions that might go in the chat box. So if you do have a summary, feel free to put it in the chat box now. And happy to answer questions. Okay, I don't see any summaries in the chat box, which is fine. So are there questions, curiosities, things you'd like to share from your groups?
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me, Rebecca?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead, Nelson. Thank you.
So in our group, I think we were in room number 8. We were talking about in the African American church, how this issue of mental illness it's not dealt with. It's not preached about. It's not taught about. It's kind of like we just don't do a good job of that. And I'm interested to know in your studies and in your travels, what have you found out?
Yeah, I mean, that is more common than not. Faculty member Jessica Brown has a really good book about It's Healing at the Well. And I think a list of resources in general are going to go out to all registered participants, so you can look for the information there. She looks specifically at the way the Black church and issues of stigma and mental illness come together. And so that's one particular resource I would commend. But I do think it is the exception rather than the norm that a congregation is comfortable talking about mental illness. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in my next reflection, and invite us to talk about some times when we might have seen that go differently. I think that stigma creates a kind of fear, creates a kind of uncertainty that means it's hard to know where to begin. There's a kind of vulnerability there, both for those who suffer and for those who might want to help. So I think part of the trick, part of the hope is figuring out how to move beyond that stigma. I'm unable to talk and read the comments at the same time, of course, but I will try to peek at those, and Rebecca's going to help me moderate questions. And Rebecca, you're also welcome to pull out themes there. And thanks for that question.
Yeah, there's some questions from D. Shore. In group 2, can the church be a source of trauma, and how do we look at that? And can we look at mental health and spiritual health along a spectrum rather than say mental health versus mental illness, rather than a contrasting kind of
Yeah,
thing.
great questions. Thank you, Dee. I do think, particularly anytime there is vulnerability, so in suffering and illness, and the response that one receives is not just what one expects, but is perhaps harmful, dismissive, too simplistic, that can create a kind of trauma, which then deepens stigma, deepens suffering, injects a kind of shame in where it does not belong in a kind of suffering. So I absolutely think that missteps can happen here. There's an author, a friend, Kate Bowler, who I'll offer some words from later, who's written a book called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. And she's writing about her own cancer diagnosis, but there's this sense that trying to make a response too simplistic or turning suffering into good automatically, there are risks with that. And I do think, to the second part of the question about a spectrum of health and illness, one of the things that Cotton Mather, that Puritan era clergyman, said is we are all sick in some way. There's some moment where reason will do nothing for any of us at some spot. And so I do think mental health is a spectrum that we all sit on. I'll cite some more specifics in a minute that indicates that mental illness, as defined in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, the document that defines mental illness, is something that's going to touch all of us directly or indirectly in our lives. And so I think a sort of black and white, broken leg or not broken leg, sick or not sick, is in fact too simplistic. And that probably also, that simplistic way of looking at things makes conversation more difficult as well.
Looks like there's been some really good discussions in the groups. Are there any other questions that anybody has that you'd like to deal with right now?
I just wanted to make a comment. We have in the Southern Province a mental and brain health group, and we included brain health partly in relation to stigma. And when we presented almost 2 years ago to the ministers in the Southern Province, we had in their packet brain scans of people with the diagnosed mental illnesses showing the differences. So it's actually we say mental, but it's also a physical condition as well in many situations. So it helped people sort of think differently. And the other thing I shared is the initial question in a TED Talk that we also presented was, why should we care? And the answer was, because Christ cared. And that simple quote made a huge difference to me as we went forward.
Thanks, Peggy.
Can you share that TED Talk at some point, like however, like back to Rebecca, so we could have.
I can find it and we'll put it
Thanks.
in there.
I can go look too, but that interests me greatly. I think as the church leaders need to be, it would be helpful for something to come to church leaders to look at how are we addressing it with our congregations, not just put it all on the pastor, but say, as congregations, we need to be taking care of our members, and how are we doing that? I mean, at some point too, as the Moravian Church, to be looking at what are we doing actively to address the concerns.
And also having known resources available to everyone, not just pastors. And on our website, we have every Moravian church in the Southern Province, the community resources that are available. So putting that into the hands of lots of people is important.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy and Carol. I spoke with a congregation last weekend, and I could see some of the questions starting to point only to the clergy as the only person in the room who was responsible for mental illness, and was trying to shift in response a sense of awareness and education on the part of the full community that can enable better care. So that's an important point. And if you layer that on top of the statistics that show there may be deepened stigma for clergy who suffer, that is, maybe offering a triple or a quadruple burden on clergy.
Heather, this is Betsy Miller. I'm wondering, I was just sort of pondering if the response during COVID, when folks were so attentive to the depression that many were able to name out loud, perhaps for the first time in that venue and for that purpose, could be a starting point for normalizing care. And if you have any suggestions on how we might go about taking the next step to say, okay, well, it's not just COVID, what else might there be? So just curious about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there are a number of places like that, these sort of moments of heightened awareness that I want to put some hopefulness in, and I think are possible. So the basic answer here is sharing statistics and sharing realities, I think, can be really helpful. I have hoped for a while that as particularly studies around PTSD and service members sit in the forefront, and that might serve to destigmatize mental illness a little bit. I recently ran into a chaplain at the VA who talked about the fact that their work with service members, it was really hard to get service members to name their own distress. And so my hope that might be a destigmatizing spot was dashed a little bit. But I do think simply tending to any discomfort in ourselves at having conversations and what we see about others, and finding places to just chip away at conversation might be good. So I don't have a magic wand kind of response there, but a hope. Maggie, I see, and then I see.
Thank you.
Judy.
I'm curious. It sounds, I'm noticing that there are a number of congregations or areas that are exploring this. And I'm thinking it would be really helpful if we could do access to what Southern Province has already gathered. But if there is a way that we could share information, share resources we have found, or share things that we're finding working in our own communities, so that would help all of us explore together. That was all that I wanted to note. Thanks.
I think that'd be great, Maggie. And again, in the resource document that will get shared with everybody at the end, I have listed a number of denominational resources, including the UCC, including the Southern Province efforts, but we might be able to cross-list that kind of information and share to make sure we've got an expanded set of resources.
Thanks.
So I see Judy's iPad. I don't know which of you on screen has the question, but invite you into asking a question.
I want to reinforce that concept of sharing. I think because it has been such a stigmatized, silent topic, it is so important, not only sharing within clergy, but also within members of churches. Maggie, Judy, and I are part of a mental health awareness team at Central. We are developing programs and ways we can inform people in the community as well as in the church. I think that the sharing vulnerabilities is also a very important thing. Judy and I had the experience of the suicide death of our son, September 1st of last year. He was a COVID physician at the University of North Carolina who took his own life. We as a family have been open right from the beginning with the obituary that was written by our 17-year-old granddaughter. And we have received incredible, incredible support right from the beginning, from Central, from people in the community, and from people we will never know and probably never meet. But that concept of sharing vulnerabilities, I think, is so important in the field of mental health, not just with depression or suicide, but with mental illness.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm so sorry for that loss. And thank you for your bravery and vulnerability in sharing. And I'm grateful for the support you've received.
We are too.
Rebecca, I wonder if we might shift to the next part of the conversation.
Yep, I think that's a good time. Oh, we got one more question.
Okay, Sue and Brad.
Actually, it's not a question. It's a comment about, I was part of the team that got together the resources for the website for the Southern Province. And one of the things that we've got a lot of information as far as just general mental health, but we also have organizations that we have locally that we're a part of, like the Mental Health Association and NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And we made resources available for all the different areas that, we put up links to where they could go to their specific NAMI. If they were in Florida, there may be a NAMI there. If they were, that kind of thing, or the Mental Health Association that's the closest to them. That could easily be done in the Northern Province as well, just trying to locate the various organizations.
Thank you, Sue. Yes, NAMI has chapters nearly everywhere, has a FaithNet connection, and often folks who are willing to come to congregations and to be in conversation.
Want to move on to the scripture?
Yeah, let me shift now. I'm going to skip our 5-minute break, but trust if you all, while you are listening, would benefit from standing up and stretching, you can do that in this next segment of conversation. I want to offer some reflections on scripture to continue our conversation along these same lines. So I'm really grateful for this invitation to reflect with you all, with any group of people, about Christianity and mental health and mental illness. As you've heard, as a person of faith and as a historian, I'm fascinated by how beliefs shape actions or alternately don't seem to influence them at all. I'm particularly interested in this interaction of belief and action around times of suffering. Mental illness, as it sounds like many of you know, first and second hand, brings complicated distress at times, both for those who suffer directly and for those who care about them. And so in this next section, I want to look more specifically about how people of faith might respond to such suffering. And if you are a member of Central Moravian Church, you will recognize some of these reflections from some time together earlier this fall. In this next segment of our time together, using scripture as a guide, I'll reflect about how we might respond to issues of mental wellness and illness through compassion and hospitality. And I'll draw today from 2 texts, one from Job and one from Mark, and I'm going to begin by reading those. So first from Job 23, and this is verses 1 through 9 and 16 and 17. Then Job answered, "Today also my complaint is bitter. His hand is heavy despite my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his dwelling. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, but he would give heed to me. There, an upright person could reason with him, and I should be acquitted forever by my judge. If I go forward, he is not there, or backward, I cannot perceive him. On the left, he hides, and I cannot behold him. I turn to the right, but I cannot see him. God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me. If only I could vanish in darkness, and thick darkness would cover my face." And from Mark chapter 10, verses 17 through 31. As Jesus was setting out on a journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. You know the commandments. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not defraud. Honor your father and mother." He said to Jesus, "Teacher, I have kept all of these since my youth." Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said, "You lack one thing. Go, sell what you own and give money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." When the man heard this, he was shocked and went away grieving, for he had many possessions. Then Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, "How hard will it be for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God?" And the disciples were perplexed at these words. But Jesus said to them again, "Children, how hard it is to enter the kingdom of God. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. They were greatly astounded and said to one another, then who can be saved? Jesus looked at them and said, for mortals, it is impossible, but not for God. For God, all things are possible. Peter began to say to him, look, we have left everything and followed you. Jesus said, truly, I tell you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for my sake and for the sake of the good news, who will not receive 100-fold now in this age, houses, brothers and sisters, mothers and children and fields with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. These texts from Job and Mark offer a faithful, fruitful place to land for thinking about how we might respond to mental illness. Before I turn to scripture in a bit more detail, I want to offer another quick glimpse into the past and some recent data. Discussion about mental health and mental illness appears in public and in congregational conversations with some frequency these days, but that is a fairly recent phenomenon. Some people in some congregations have spoken about faith and mental illness well for a long time, but most American churches are just beginning to figure out how they might consider the suffering connected to mental illness as part of their witness and ministry. Here's a snapshot from American congregational life just over a half century ago. In 1968, a Presbyterian elder wrote an article in a monthly denominational publication as part of a series titled Life's Hard Questions. His contribution to that series asked, how should the church handle mental illness? Instead of using his real name in print, he chose to write anonymously. Using the pseudonym Jim, he shared that he, his wife, and their children had belonged to 6 different Presbyterian congregations as they moved around the country. He explained that his wife's severe depression made life difficult in each church. Each time illness struck, word of the cause of her hospitalization spread, and Jim encountered from other parishioners what he named the nervous glance, followed by pained silence. The news of mental illness, he recalled, whether depression, nervous breakdown, or psychosis of any kind, swept through the grapevine overnight. With a dose of sarcasm, Jim observed that faithful churchgoers, who I'm sure always take the log out of their own eyes before looking for specks in the eyes of their brothers, tend to close both eyes tightly and pretend that mental illness just doesn't exist. Jim reported that in some congregations, 4 or 5 of his wife's hospitalizations because of mental illness went unreported in church literature, unmentioned from church pulpits, and unprayed for during worship services. In contrast, he observed, you quickly qualify for each of these if you happen to be injured in an automobile accident. Even their minister struggled to offer more than a hesitant, Jim, how are things? In his article, Jim lamented not just that the congregations they joined, but the wider church had failed in her educational and healing ministry. Some Christians, he noticed, were still under the unfortunate illusion, a remnant of the Dark Ages, that mental illness is the sign of divine judgment for past sin. Eventually, Jim and his wife talked more openly. They hoped sharing their experiences would bring change, and to their surprise, as they began to be more forthright, they learned that despite hushed conversations, nearly everyone we talked to either has had similar experiences or knows of other cases. Does any of that sound familiar here 53 years later? Jim's observations from decades ago were right about the pervasiveness of mental illness. Data from the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, tells us that 1 in 5 Americans lives with a mental health condition. That includes anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and many other ailments. Some conditions come and go, others persist. And so the percentage of us that will experience mental illnesses firsthand over the course of our lifetimes is even higher. And given that prevalence, it seems likely that nearly all of us will have proximity to the suffering connected to mental health disorders, likely both as those impacted directly and as those who love and accompany those who suffer. And thinking about our responsibility to one another, even with the sort of hyper individualism that Americans seem to so cherish. Author Kate Bowler reminds us that we're all taking turns being the sick one or being the well one. Keeping in mind our responsibility to one another just might ease suffering when it inevitably arrives. Given the pervasiveness of suffering and some definite willingness to talk more openly about mental illness in the past few decades, I would love to tell you that the experiences like Jim's were now the exception and not the norm. I suspect, though, that many of us have stories that display that stigma and fear and suffering itself continue to make knowing how to ask for help for ourselves and for loved ones difficult. They also make figuring out how to help when asked equally challenging. Quite early in my own thinking about mental illness and congregational life, I belonged to a church that had an abundant casserole ministry. Some of you will know this church. Literally, there was a refrigerator with casseroles in it. If a loved one died, you would be well fed. If your child faced unexpected surgery, a meal would surely appear and help ease the burden. I started to wonder about why the provision of casseroles, let alone congregational prayers, seems so much harder to come by for individuals and for families when mental illness was in the mix. Hospitalizations for depression were hushed. Suicides were only named in whispers in the hallways. There were no casseroles for some suffering. And the silence and the absence of care seemed to deepen the suffering and leave people detached from their community, a community that in other ways was great at offering support. I do think the stigma around mental illness is easing a bit, but this is still complicated space for so many, as you all named in reflections from the first part of today's conversation. And suffering is real. Okay, so what now? How might belief and practice, faith and action align more closely when mental health disorders are in the mix? These are the questions I had in mind as I turn to these scripture passages. The combined insight from Mark and Job struck me as pointing us to one particular sort of witness, one particular what now. In the reading from the Gospel of Mark, we find a rich young man asking Jesus about how he can continue to move toward perfection in the life of discipleship. He had done all the right things since his youth. He'd honored his parents, hadn't defrauded anyone, murdered, stolen things, or any of the other prohibitions in the 10 Commandments. And he asked what he should do next. It seems to me that the response from Jesus for the man to sell all that he owns is more about what the rich young man should be rather than what he should do. What if this invitation from Jesus isn't actually about changing the physical state of the rich young man, about depriving him of his wealth, as much as it is an invitation for him to understand the experiences of others? What if Jesus invited him to sell all he owned, not simply to be poor for the sake of being poor, but rather to experience poverty in order to better understand those who suffer in ways he'd never experienced? Yes, the call was to sell all he owned, but perhaps so that he might see the world differently. Understanding more deeply would then reshape his future discipleship. This, I think, might be the what now, the so what for us too. Discipleship is about love, not the love of oneself, not simply about doing things rightly in one's own life, but about loving others. It's about entering into suffering, even if we can't fix it. Without his wealth, the rich young man couldn't actually fix what he probably thought was broken about others, but he could accompany them. He could enter into their suffering and try to understand. And in doing so, he could hope to share and ease some of the burden. And that might be enough, even more than enough. Jesus's answer to the rich young man, the text tells us, was offered out of love, a loving response given in hopes of propagating love. The rich young man more than bristled at the invitation from Jesus. When he heard this, he was shocked and went away grieving, for he had many possessions. What we hear in the Mark passage is a call to do the impossible, or the near impossible, or at least something that calls for action that no one wants to take. Maybe what we're called to do is to enter the experience of suffering with others. The only way to really know what the poor would need is to be poor. If we want to do something in the face of the suffering mental health challenges bring, maybe the only way to know what to do is to first try to understand what it's like to suffer, or to have someone trusted enough to share our burden with. Today's text from Job is clear about the impact of acute suffering. By the time we encounter Job in today's passage, he has lost his reputation, his possessions, his family, and his health. His suffering seems without end, and even the friends who he had thought might offer some comfort had turned to trying to figure out how suffering this severe and this prolonged must actually be Job's fault. Job is unwilling to hide or to minimize his suffering. Job's complaint is bitter. He groans, his heart is faint, he's terrified. He wishes he could vanish in darkness. Somehow, though, amid that suffering, Job hasn't given up belief that God exists and that God is just. He trusts God, even if God remains hidden. But Job does want to have a few words with the Creator. He longs to state his case, to explain why all of this suffering is unjust, and then to hear God's logic, to experience God's presence. Though still deep in despair and unable to experience a God he finds hidden, Job keeps hope. Ultimately, Job's friends proved unhelpful in his suffering, and so he's on his own in navigating this despair. What if we, by sitting in the place of Job's friends, started by listening and lamented, by entering into suffering, by refusing to fall into the trap of justifying or explaining, by refusing to avoid the sharing of pain, and by leaning into the costly nature of discipleship? What if we could not only ease the burden of those who suffer, but we might also make visible God's loving presence? Suffering is hard and isolating. Compassion and hospitality look like listening, like not shying away from pain and distress. Compassion and hospitality and love look like making space for lament, like joining in that lament, like simply being present without trying to fix things, at least without hearing directly from the one who suffers what fixing might look like. These readings from Mark and from Job offer an invitation to think about a call to discipleship in light of mental illness. Discipleship is the costly and hard thing that Jesus asks of us. That call is to place ourselves in spaces where we might fully understand the sort of distress that caused Job to cry out. Thinking specifically about mental illness, how might we undertake this sort of discipleship? These are questions that you all asked after our first session. How can we offer this sort of loving witness? We might read a memoir by one who suffers, listen to a friend, go to a lecture, read up on types of illness. We can muster the courage not to turn away from expressions of worry and fear and sadness and anger and irritability. We can trust narrations of physical pain when there doesn't seem to be a cause. We can figure out how simply to be present and not feel compelled to fix something we can't. The good news, as the one who suffers or the one who accompanies, is that we can enter these places of suffering resting in the assurance that God is present. We can embody the good news of God's grace and steadfastness by simply being present and listening, by holding the pain of others and seeking to understand. As a starting place, that is enough, more than enough. It is love and witness to divine love. By entering as fully as possible into the depths of pain of others, by being trustworthy listeners, we'll also be better equipped to celebrate times of relief and healing. We might then be able to name relief as miraculous as the healing Jesus brought to those we hear about in the chapters of Mark that precede today's reading. Those who had experienced paralysis, blindness, withered limbs, and many other ailments. Friends, suffering is real. We might not be able to fix it or make it go away, but we can be present with one another in the middle of it. Here I want to close with a few words from the Moravian Liturgy for Peace and Justice. Let us not lose hope or courage, but rather trusting in God's call to us, may we walk in the paths God has chosen and do justice, show constant love, and walk humbly with God and with one another. May it be so. With those reflections on Scripture in mind, I'm going to invite us to spend a few more minutes, maybe a little bit shorter period than last time. Back in small groups, you will see from Rebecca in the chat a handful of questions to prompt to conversation, and invite you to think about, some of these invite us to think about what are things we might want to do with ourselves, with one another, the sort of questions that you all started to pose earlier. So Rebecca, we're ready to head into small groups again and see you back here in a few minutes. Okay, as we come back together, I invite you, as you did last time, if you have some summary reflections from your group, to place them in the chat box so that everyone can read those. And then we'll have some conversation together. I'm curious, your reflections on that sense of discipleship, whether you shared any times you have experienced that kind of presence and accompaniment in productive ways, and to hear whether there are any commitments that came to mind for you as your congregation as a way to begin to tend to the suffering that can be present with mental health disorders. So feel free whenever you're ready to put things in the chat. And as we did last time, with help from Rebecca, we will see what questions and comments folks have. Feel free to raise your hand to pose questions in the chat.
Heather, as we begin, I wanted to make just a comment. Our work in the Southern Province was initiated by a young female pastor in our province with courage, passion, foresight, and experience, who asked others to join her in this journey. And taking that first step, I've always been grateful to her for taking that first step, because it takes courage. And this, I'm talking like 7 or 8 years ago. And, this is how we were able to really address the concern with someone with the courage to come forward and says, let's do this together. And it's been a journey for us, and it's been one I'm grateful for. Thanks,
Peggy. And thanks for naming courage. As something it takes to inhabit that kind of vulnerability. And I'm guessing care on the other side, that courage is met with care. Okay, enjoying reading comments as they're coming in about showing up and being present, how to inhabit a kind of non-anxious presence. My sense is that listening is actually easier than we think. And so if we posit listening as a starting point, that might be way less intimidating than trying to fix everything, which in fact we can't. Yeah.
Heather, I mean, you know that I teach at Lancaster Seminary in the doctoral program. My seminar is called Listening is an Act of Love.
Mhm.
And I shared this in a small group. And I so wholeheartedly agree that listening is very simple, but good listening is actually very, very hard. And listening without all those scripts in the back of your brain running that oh yeah, that relates, that's just like my Uncle Joe, or jumping in to try to fix the things that people are saying. In the seminar, I've done it for 11 years now, all with mostly established pastors who all think they're great listeners. And after the first assignment, one guy who'd been at the same church for 23 years came in and said, "I've been a fraud," because he thought he baptized, married, buried all these people. He thought he knew everything. When he really listened, he didn't know nearly what he thought he knew. And just very quickly, I mean, I used to be gentle with how to help students do this. And now my instruction to them is to shut up, and to just shut up and listen. And if you really try that, it's a hard thing to do, but it can be deeply transformative.
Thank you, Marty. I was going to ask for, some summary of your semester-long doctoral class. So thank you for offering a tip or two. Yeah, and for the reminder that listening is easy, but good listening is hard. I think that that's really important. It is about getting oneself out of the way. Just yesterday, I read a reflection from a high schooler who suffers with anxiety and depression, who talked about the place of their friends simply in listening, and was struck by that teenager's ability to name a kind of good listening, which was not about probably the kind of adult, let's fix it kind of things that I imagine they heard in their life, but that kind of good listening.
As a framework, I mean, you all in the southern states in North Carolina and all, Mary McClintock Fulkerson is at Duke. And she, one of her books is called Places of Redemption. And she talks about creating places to appear, right? And her beginning assumption is that we all live in oblivion. If we think about all the people that we encounter in our lives that we'll never know anything about and who will never know anything about us. And she points to the great gift it is to allow someone sacred space to really be who they are and to be validated for being that. And I think it's a great gift. It's really, truly not an easy read, but it's really a worthwhile read.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. She was one of my teachers at Duke, and so thank you for naming her. She has shaped how I have thought about this. So are there go ahead, Rebecca. Thank you.
Sorry, there's sort of a question in the group one's reflection. It says, at what point do we risk becoming overwhelmed? And at what point do we need to let go so that others can seek the help they need, which is beyond our reach? And so I think talking about the tension between being able to listen, but also to not overextend and offer care that we aren't qualified to provide, the tension between those two pieces. If I didn't get that summarized right, somebody can chime in.
Yeah, I think that's an important part. Some of you will be familiar with the Congregational ministry, Stephen Ministers. Stephen Ministry has in print a way for those caregivers to think about what is the listening that belongs with the Stephen Minister, sort of a peer-to-peer accompaniment, and when might somebody need a different kind of listening and care and referral. And so here too, I think gaining knowledge about what sits within one's ability to accompany and what might require additional resources can be part of an educational process. I point to Stephen Ministry simply because it's one place I have seen articulate well where those handoffs are. But here's also where the kind of local advocacy organizations like NAMI, which some of you have mentioned and sounds like you have experience, can be helpful in thinking about, and handoff is one word, but handoff implies, maybe my role as friend and listener stops, and that's not the case. There can be a web, a network of resources that are present. So I think taking, the sort of passion and advocacy I see on the screen this morning demonstrates to me a kind of depth of knowledge in congregations already, and figuring out how to tap into that wisdom, tap into resources, and share resources seems good and important in this work.
Well, another resource is the mental health first aid course. And I imagine everybody on this meeting has had a first aid course, whether it was younger and in Scouts or whatever. But we have offered that level 1 to our pastors, and we need to go forward and do the level 2. Because for me personally, I had that fear that I might say or do something wrong unintentionally because I didn't know what to do or didn't have enough background. There's a youth mental health first aid that has just come out, I think probably within this past year. So there are resources available in your community that can help educate us in and helping us to be a bit more comfortable in taking and confident in taking that next step.
Yeah. Thanks, Peggy. Let me respond to one of the comments from Group 1. Thank you, Michael, for sharing that. There's a sense of churches as spiritual Disneylands, and that made me, so my work in this area was really shaped by time spent in CPE as a student chaplain at a state mental hospital. I see Jennifer, who's a chaplain at Lancaster Theological Seminary, with some shared experience there, perhaps. And I learned I learned so many things, but I learned about preaching in congregations by preaching at a state mental hospital, because the gospel, the good news of the gospel, couldn't be fluffy and superficial in a room where people were voluntarily and involuntarily committed for their own safety and well-being, and where I had to, walk through 4 locked doors to preach. There was a kind of clarity and truth about preaching in that environment that made me realize the kind of social norm that often exists in congregations for everyone to be fine. That may not be exactly where Group 1 was headed, with that sense of a Disneyland, a spiritual Disneyland in church. But I think, for those of us who've had the privilege of sitting in worship in a place where you can see the congregation and know that rarely are all eyes dry in any given worship service on a given day, that's kind of a breakthrough of the reality of those of us in the pews at any time, and remembering that sense that, in fact, even though the congregation all looks fine, we're real humans sitting in the pews. One of my favorite worship experiences, and it looks like Rebecca's maybe has another question, was an evening worship service at a congregation that had a Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous group, NA and NA groups, and the groups met before worship. Folks headed to the parking lot to chat and went straight into worship in a way that they didn't. Often NA and AA meetings happen in church basements on Wednesday, Thursday evenings when folks aren't really seen by the congregation, but this is a place where people entered worship as fully themselves as I've seen any place. And there was a kind of deep beauty to that for me, and in allowing, it changed the nature of worship to know that we were all there together. Rebecca, was there another question? I was watching facial expressions from you.
I'm just trying to get a link for the rescue that Marty mentioned. So just making sure we collect the resources that are mentioned in the conversation.
Other questions, curiosities? Did someone make a commitment about something they or their congregation might do that you would like to name out loud in a way to hold yourself accountable to yourself, to learn more? I don't mean to put anyone on the spot, but sometimes saying things out loud can be helpful. Yeah, Randall.
I have just an observation. We were talking at the beginning about how this can't all devolve onto the pastor.
Mhm.
And yet everything we've been talking about, at least in this session, has to do with the pastor, including people who are pastors who are working on a DMin, which is a very rare group. So I'm wondering, whereas the problem really isn't the pastor, the problems I've seen with regard to these issues is in the congregation. I was sharing in our small group the year I was unemployed before I was hired at Notre Dame. And when I went from being employed at Colgate Rochester Seminary, I was a member of this Episcopal church. When I became unemployed, I was completely isolated from the congregation. No one knew what to say to me. No one knew how to talk to me because I was a failure, right? And so until I got the job at Notre Dame, then all of a sudden I was a success, and all this great things happened. So how do we train? It's hard enough to train pastors to be any good at this. How do we change the ethos of congregations so that we actually learn how to embrace our own vulnerability and therefore become more hospitable to the vulnerabilities of others? Because I think that's the issue. Pastors can't do this on their own. It's just impossible. And actually, they're not the ones who often cause the most harm in the first place. I mean, some do, but oftentimes it's congregation members interacting with each other. So how do we change the ethos of congregations so that they become places of hospitality toward the vulnerable rather than celebrations of success?
Yeah, that's a great point. And Donna may have her hand up in response. I welcome witness that folks have seen in congregations. I think, and here clergy may have a role, but trying to resist being the solver of all things, from leaks in bathrooms through mental health issues, is important for clergy in general. But I think encouraging those who speak to take a kind of quiet or not so quiet leadership role in forming spaces where people can be in conversation. I think clergy, again, I'm still talking about clergy, but I think that there is a way that clergy can model their own comfort in talking about things that can open space for congregation members to have broader conversation. Yeah, but this is complicated, and life as the clergy as central leader carries so much weight and burden and joy and gift and weight and burden, that figuring out how to do that. And I wonder if even naming some of that as clergy can help distribute that. I think congregations that do things like read books together, that are drawn together by folks who are not clergy, can help here in providing resources. But I wonder if, since Donna and Walter's hands went up in the middle of this, if you all or someone else has recommendations of something you have witnessed that has gone well, I'd love to interject that into the conversation. So Donna, and you are on mute.
As laity, I'm in a Methodist church here in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, but I love the Moravian church. But I found in my particular church is people sharing their stories. If we can share our stories and find people, we have a particular family who does have mental illness in their family, and they have shared their story, and it really made an impact. So I think if people could share their stories, not only on mental illness, but a lot of things in life, I think that's one way as laity we can help.
Thanks, Donna. Walter.
I don't have a response to your question so much. If you want to move on with that, that's fine. Or I can pose a question.
Pose a question, and if folks have responses, we can come back.
So as a young adult, I considered myself an agnostic. I had a close friend who became engaged in a charismatic Pentecostal congregation, and they told me some of the things that they were being taught, and I said, anybody that believes that needs psychiatric help, But later in my life, as a person of deep faith, I encountered someone from a different culture who came to me and told me that they had had a vision about me. And because there was a language difference, I said, "Do you mean a dream?" And he said, "No, a vision." And he described this vision to me, which I sort of wrote off, you know. But then later on, my experience seemed to fulfill the vision that he had seen. So I just want to ask your thoughts, if it's appropriate here, to sorting out that which is spiritual, mystical, ecstatic versus mental illness. I mean, sometimes we look at, oh, Paul had this experience on the road. It was probably a mental health issue, or was it a spiritual thing? Yeah, so sorting all that out, I just kind of put that in front of you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not going to have a definitive answer there, but let me say a couple things in response. I mean, through my my look at the history, there has always been a thread, this thread of individuals and communities trying to discern whether a religious or spiritual experience was real or a problem, right? And so I think that that's always going to exist. Even the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, the medical volume that defines for medical and insurance purposes what illness is, gives some leeway for culture in terms of experiences and how that shapes what a thing that might be defined as illness in one place is simply part of experience in another culture. So I don't have a good response except to, this is my response to many things, but to invite a kind of curiosity. And in the Moravian tradition, I mean, this is our sense of the interpretation of scripture happens most faithfully in community. And I think that sense of interpretation of experience also happens most faithfully in community. And so it's not a direct response, except in an invitation to be curious, and maybe back to Marty's point about good listening. Good listening involves not projecting or presuming that one's own experiences are related to or shape listening and the experience of others. Carol, I see your hand, and you're unmuted.
Am I muted? I'm unmuted.
Nope, you're good.
I found it very helpful to just have, as you said, a curiosity and an openness to the kind of spiritual nature of individuals. Because individuals are just so varied and different, especially in what I can, there's some people who just walk close to heaven their whole lives. And they have imagination and ideas that have never been part of my experience, but they are so, you can tell that they've been closer to heaven and see heaven. And it's that kind of thing. And you go, I just have to let this person be there and honor their spiritual experience and watch for the things that are dangerous, watch for the danger. But people are so varied and different in the way they apprehend spirituality and express it. And I have found that to be fascinating. It's like the difference in working with a child's imagination and a fully mature adult's imagination. And just having the opportunity to be involved with all of that experience is really rather rich. And so I like Walter, I'm not going to say, oh, that's just wrong. That can't be God. That's not God. I would say, oh, how interesting, or, and I think that being open to their experience is really important.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. I think here to some connections to the comments that Randall made a few minutes ago in terms of suspending a kind of normativity about what it means to be a right and good Christian or member of a community, right? So what is, this will vary a little bit by congregation probably, but it is a person who looks this way, acts this way, sounds this way, has this kind of employment, can narrate this kind of history. And we all know that life is more complicated to that. And so I think even being attentive to what the kind of normativities are, what the expectations are in a community, can help us then notice them in a way that we might help ease some of the burden that interjects. I see Marty and then maybe Walter again, and then Peggy. And Rebecca, you can help us pay attention to time here overall. So Marty.
Just to quickly double back to what Donna said about telling stories, pastors can create sacred space in which people can share stories. And when we did this in my congregation, we had folks coming forward who were pillars of the community, who no one knew what was happening behind closed doors. We had two sets of grandparents whose grandchildren were at that moment psychiatrically hospitalized. They were able to talk about that. And so creating that space, because part of the antidote to stigma is normalizing people's experiences. And part of normalizing is realizing that congregations aren't bound by HIPAA, right? We are held to a standard of confidentiality, but we're also different than that. We're also community in a different sense. So pushing that ability to share people's stories and create that space really does make a difference, I think.
Thanks, Marty. Peggy.
I don't think I've mentioned this, but we struggled for several years to what to call our ministry. And we finally settled on Just As I Am. And I think we all come at any moment just as we are. And learning to love people and support people in that framework is so important.
For a little while this fall at Moravian Theological Seminary, the whiteboard in the hallway invited input about what is hospitality. And there were lots of comments about it on the board about inviting the other in. And my maybe slightly pesky response to that board was to try to disrupt a sense that hospitality is about there being an other, which kind of implies, again, this sense that there are those of us who are not other for some reason. And so as we think about hospitality, right now, that conversation on the whiteboard is rooted in the Greek word at the root of hospitality, and inviting all of us to think about what it means to be called by God as strangers, all of us who are invited to the table by God. Carol, I see your hand raised.
I am one of those people who has a tendency to leave something like this and say, I need to do something right now, which is really a bad part of my life. But I am taking notes from everything that people are saying, because you can't just jump into this and then cause more damage than good. So as I'm taking notes, I'm saying that yes, sharing stories is important. So is listening and not trying to fix something, and providing support, and make sure we talk about secrecy and confidentiality so that people feel comfortable. I am just sharing that I need to make sure that I don't go off and try to do something too quickly, that ought to be done thoughtfully and with care, so that we're being helpful, not hurtful in the process.
Yeah. I think that's a great idea. Let me offer, I often have mental images for things. And so if this one works for you, great. If it doesn't, you can just ignore it. But in that sense that trying to do a big thing to bring change sometimes can backfire, not work, not be effective. For a long time in my early work as being dean of a seminary, I thought about organizational change in a light switch model of change. I assumed there must be some giant light switch that if I could find it, I could muscle the energy to shift it, and the organization would change in the way we would need it to change. And what I discovered, and Carol, your comment made me think about this, is actually there were 75 different light switches spread around campus, and I couldn't touch them all at once. And so I needed to figure out how to deploy the community to figure out which of those light switches worked, which didn't, and in what order we move them. So I think thinking about health, illness, stigma in a congregation, and well-being, and figuring out what are those points of things that can make a difference, and knowing no one person can actually find the giant light switch and move it. But an invitation, as you all have said, to kind of create spaces of hospitality would be great, and a kind of safe, good, productive vulnerability. I see Judy.
This is the last question.
It's a comment and a question. Kay Warren's name was mentioned. Kay and Rick Warren have experienced the suicide death of their son, and he's at Saddleback. Kay and Rick are at Saddleback Church in California. They have proposed a model for development within congregations of mental health programs based on something called crawl, walk, and run, where they systematically introduce concepts, then they reinforce it, and then they really move it to the next step of really looking at development of programs. So that's one thing that we have looked at, and we're crawling, but we're at least working along a model. The second thing is, have any of you run into congregational needs assessments of what the congregational needs are, rather than us doing planning in a vacuum of what are the needs within your congregation for mental health?
I don't know of any of those, but if folks do, I wonder if you might stick your name and contact information in the chat if you'd be willing to be in conversation. I think sharing resources is really important here. Rebecca, I want to turn things over to you. I'm happy to say another couple of words, but want to see if you've got things to offer now.
I do. Just in your chat box, I've put the current contact information for our mental and brain health group here in the Southern Province. But there are lots of resources that, as I said, are available to people in other places, and we can look at maybe expanding that as we share those resources together. I'm also going to include a survey link that we ask that you answer, just to let us know what worked about this event, what could have been better, and help us to continue offering events that kind of support and encourage you in your ministries wherever they find you. So I just want to give a huge round of applause, I guess, on Zoom for Heather. This was really wonderful. Thank you so much for offering your insights and your expertise in this matter. And for all of you who offered your resources. And as Heather said, if you want to include your contact information, if you have other resources that you'd like to provide, we'd be glad to kind of bring those together. We'll be sending out another email on Monday to give you the resources that Heather has put together so that you can have those as well. And we'll try to include some that you've asked for in the chat. Please feel free to contact me if there's something that's missing that you want to know, and I'll try to get it for you. So Heather, as you can have the last word.
Again, my thanks to each of you for spending time this morning, thinking, sharing, listening, witnessing. I am grateful for you. I am aware that among us, at least of those of you who I know, and I don't know all of you, that there are Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, United Church of Christ folks, and Moravians here. And I am especially grateful for this shared witness today, this morning, and being together. I think that this is how we will forge the most faithful future together. Thanks for your attentiveness. Go off into the world with strength and bravery and good listening, with Marty in our ears, good listening, and willingness to try and see if we can help alleviate some suffering. Thanks very much. Have a good weekend. I look forward to continued conversation.